back a date a little over 50 years ago that everybody in the room remembers, October 4th, 1957, right? We know what happened on that day. How does Congress respond to Sputnik? How do you respond to that? And the House, run then by Speaker Sam Rayburn, was thinking that one of the best ways to do it was to create a select committee, a joint committee actually, on the House, joint committee, the House and the Senate, on science and astronautics. But they were thinking about it, and they realized that if we had a joint committee, all the senators would take the spotlight, which is just what happened, at least it's now. And so the House created its own select committee on science. Very interesting, a bipartisan committee with Majority Leader McCormick, and as a Democrat, and also former Speaker Joe Martin running that committee, setting it up as a select committee. But it's interesting the relationships between the two bodies, which Don has very helpfully described, because I was going to say in some ways very similar things. Because if you want one thing to know about how the House of Representatives operates, you have to understand that it's run by the majority. It's a majority rule. And everybody thinks, oh yeah, we all know that. No, you don't. You don't quite understand what that means. And I want us to think about that, because that is something that the founders, well, you have the Constitution, and I know you all have yours right in your pocket, so that you can refer to this, because one of the things that's been fascinating to me as a historian is looking at the beginnings, the origins, Constitutional Convention, and how these two bodies are set out in this document, but more significantly, how these two have evolved over the last 220 years. One of the things that I want us to think about as teachers and educators is to try to think of American history and American government from the perspective of Capitol Hill, from the perspective of the First Branch. They're two radically different bodies, and the more I learn and study about the House and the Senate, it is incredible how different they are. In some ways by design, but more, I think, by evolution, by how they've developed historically. That's, I think, one of the more fascinating parts of this. We do see some aspects, the relationship between House and the Senate, but also between House, Senate, and the executive branch, because much of American history and government is this constant struggle of where the primary aspect of power lies. Who sets the agenda? Is it going to be the White House? Is it going to be the Senate? Is it going to be the House? If you look at the whole of the 19th century, you can pretty much tell the history of the 19th century by really thinking about 2.5 presidents, maybe 3 presidents, if lucky. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and James K. Polk. Those are the executives who actually hold the agenda. All the rest, it's run either of the House or out of the Senate. That is where the agenda is set nationally. Now, the 20th century is a little bit different in some ways because of one of the most important presidents that we've had, not necessarily from his policy, but rather of how he was able to manage Congress. It's interesting when you look back and you look up at Capitol Hill and you realize when that building is opened in December 1800, John Adams speaks before Congress. The next president to speak before Congress is Woodrow Wilson. We go from 1800 to 1913 without the President of the United States speaking before Congress. You think about that, and you think about how we tell that story of the relationship between these two branches. Woodrow Wilson is our only PhD as president, one whose dissertation is on congressional government, one who's a student of that and who tries to turn it into a parliamentary system. And one of the things that he does in the summer of 1912 is he brings up the Democratic candidates up to his summer governor's mansion on the Jersey Shore, and he brings them up there almost, well, what another student of Congress is going to do in 1994, create a national election. Speaker Gingrich, or Republican leader Newt Gingrich, was going to school on what Woodrow Wilson was doing in 1912 when Gingrich formed the contract with America. And so one of the first things that Wilson does as president, he calls Congress into special session. and then speaks directly to Congress, laying out his agenda. And you sort of see that power shift all the way over to the White House. Now, it goes back in the 1920s, or actually it goes back in 1919, especially on foreign policy over the fight over the Versailles Treaty. But what's interesting and fascinating is to see who sets the agenda. Now, I started out with a question of majority rule. And in the House, the majority rules. What does that mean? Well, I also work with a group of teachers, and we had a question last week because I had them up. And it's kind of fun to do this because I come out of an academic environment, trained as a historian, but we had this one teacher in the group who was trained as a lawyer. And I love kind of pushing against this. And so I asked her, and I asked the group of teachers that I had, let's look at the House's role of impeachment. What does the Constitution say is an impeachable offense? And all the teachers sort of rattled off what an impeachable offense was, high crimes and misdemeanors. And I said, who defines what a high crime and misdemeanor is? And I said, well, it's undefined. So who defines what a high crime and misdemeanor is? It's whatever the House, or actually a majority of the House of Representatives, says it is. It's whatever a majority. You get 218 votes in the House of Representatives, you can do anything you want. And so I asked the question, I posed the hypothetical. Let's say late at night the president decides to get away from a hostile Congress and maybe a hostile press environment and decides to slip out of the White House, jump in a convertible, borrowing a friend's, and go zipping up the George Washington Parkway at about 99 miles an hour in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. He gets pulled over. That's reckless driving. Is that an impeachable offense? It's a misdemeanor in Virginia. Is it an impeachable offense? Of course it is. Because it's whatever the House says it is. Can the president be impeached for jaywalking? Oh, absolutely. It's whatever the House says it is. And a majority of the House, it's a majoritarian body. It has to pass through the Senate. And so I was laying out these hypotheticals. And the teacher, formerly a lawyer, was just, you could see her cringe. She says, well, no, the Supreme Court has to rule on that. No, it doesn't. And that's one of the things that's fascinating about the checks and balances placed in that the founders put in the Constitution. The House has the sole power of impeachment and the sole power to define what an impeachable offense is. 218 votes. Think about that. A couple other things, too, that I want to make sure that we understand. Last Christmas time, just before Christmas, my assistant sent me this really excited email because the President of the United States had said all federal employees would have an extra day, Christmas Eve, off. And so he sent it all excited to me. And I had to tell him, no, you do not work for the president. The president has no power over your job. You think about that. And I gave it to him anyway, okay. I let him have Christmas Eve off. But when you think about that, how many people think that the President of the United States is in charge of the American government? It's not. And we need to teach that to our students. Teach that to our students very clearly. One of the most famous, there's several famous examples of Speaker Sam Rayburn. But once he was asked by a reporter, the longest-serving Speaker of the House, starts from longest-serving Speaker of the House, going from 1940 up until 1961, with a couple changes in leadership at that point. But the longest-serving Speaker of the House, and a young reporter asked him, Mr. Speaker, how many presidents have you served under? And Sam Rayburn, you know the story. Sam Rayburn glared fiercely at that reporter and said, I've never served under anyone. I've served with 8 presidents. And that's something we want to see and teach our students, because the United States is one of the only independent legislatures on earth. And we think about that. We're the oldest constitutional government, except for Britain. We're the oldest constitutional government on earth. Most of us don't realize that and don't teach our students that. But also, we're the only independent legislative bodies on earth. And let me tell you an example of what that means, that issue of independence. I was interviewing a member of Congress. And unlike the senators, when you walk into the Senate as a freshman, you are as powerful as every other senator. The House is quite a bit different. I was interviewing a minority representative. He was a Republican who was elected in 1974. And if you remember what that is, that's the year of the Watergate babies. This enormous number of Democratic congressmen come in. Well, he's a Republican. And think about issues of power. If every freshman senator, every first-term senator, the minute he walks in, has that power of unanimous consent, one of the most weakest individuals in this whole city is a freshman congressman in the minority party. You can't do anything at that point. It's virtually nothing. Well, if you remember in 1975, we have President Ford, and he's trying to struggle as hard as he can to get a budget bill passed. He has to do this in order to set up the agenda for the next year and also to run for president. And so he's trying as hard as he can to corral up enough votes, Democrat and Republican, and so he has to keep as many Republicans as he possibly can. And so he's trying to contact this freshman congressman. Remember, the weakest individual of all, right? Can't even really speak for more than 1 minute at a time on the House floor, and that's with permission. Unlike a senator who can go on and on. A congressman can't. Well, so one of the scenarios is that the president is constantly trying to get this young congressman on the phone to push and encourage for him to get his vote. And if you've ever been up to Capitol Hill, you know you've got 3 doors of a congressman's office. You've got the main door and the other 2 for the congressman to slip out when he doesn't want to talk to somebody. And so for almost 3 weeks this went on. The president would call the congressman's office, and he just stepped out. I'm sorry, sir. And this would go on because the congressman did not want to face his own party's leader. And finally, it got down to a vote on the House floor. It was a vote on the House floor, and so this young freshman congressman was called to the floor. Well, then the president was able to nail him, called the cloakroom and sent a little page over and got him on the House floor. And so here the congressman's trapped. He'd been trying to avoid that conversation with the president for almost 3 weeks. He knew how important it was for the president's agenda, the most powerful man in the world, the president of the United States. And here he was, a member of the same party, but the weakest, a freshman representative. And finally, the page gets him, drags him off the House floor, and he goes and sits in the Republican cloakroom, and he closes the phone booth door, and it's the President of the United States on the line. Think about this and the relation of power that's here. The most powerful man in the world asking the weakest elected official, one who can't even speak on the House floor without permission, and he says, I need your vote. I really need your vote for this. And that freshman member says, I know, sir, but I'm sorry in good conscience, I cannot vote with you. Think about that. That is so exciting to see and to be a part of, because here you have the independence of a member of the House. And that, to me, is the genius of the system, because that freshman member of Congress does not work for the President of the United States. He does not work for the Speaker of the House. He does not even work for his own committee chair. He works for those 650,000 Americans that are his boss, and that's the only people that he's responsible to. And that, to me, is exciting. And so what could the president do? In a parliamentary system, it's very clear the party would not list that independent member, and he'd be off the list. In this case, he went on, and he just actually retired and then passed away. That was Henry Hyde of Illinois, a freshman member of Congress. And you think about that. Now, a couple things that I want to finish because I want to make sure that there's enough time for questions. One of the things that I want you to think about, you all teach the filibuster and how the Senate operates, because the Senate and this filibuster is an extremely important mechanism in the Senate by which it represents the right of every individual senator, the right of the minority, to actually allow their voice to be heard. And you have to allow that voice to be heard. You remember your principles in Robert's Rules, right? You've got 2 principles in Robert's Rules, even though Henry Roberts doesn't really set them out this way, but there's 2 principles. One is that the majority can never silence the minority. The evolution of the Senate has pretty much put that into place, that an individual senator can never be silenced. You have to allow that person to speak. But what's the other principle in Robert's Rules? The minority cannot stop the majority from continuing its business. And in many ways, that's how the House has evolved. There still is some minority right, but most of it is the right of the majority. You get 218 votes, you can do anything you want in the House of Representatives, literally anything. You change your rules almost constantly in the House, or can suspend the rules or change them by the vote of a simple majority. That example of impeachment is one issue. 218 votes, according to the Constitution, decides what's an impeachable offense, and nobody outside can tell them otherwise. The House has evolved in that sense. Our rights, in many ways, are rights of an individual. But our politics are the politics of groups. And the House is what represents that groups. And you look at the House and how it's organized. Party is extremely important in the House. Committees are extremely important in the House. And also these independent groups of like-minded individuals. That's where we got a whole bunch of funny names in the House, like the Blue Dog Coalition, which is a group of almost 50 democratic conservatives, fiscal conservatives, who in many ways hold the balance of power. It's interesting on how you work together in groups in that House of Representatives, whereas the Senate works together as individuals. When you teach about the filibuster, which very clearly represents that key principle in the Senate, think about teaching about the Rules Committee, which is the parallel in the House. The Senate has a rule that allows for every individual senator to speak because they are all equal. The House, they're not. A committee chair is far more powerful than a freshman member. But in the House, it's the Rules Committee that's not an umpire. And you want to make sure that your students don't understand that it's not an umpire. It's rather the gatekeeper. That is the arm of the Speaker, the arm of the majority party, by which its business, its actions are done. And almost every single vote in the Rules Committee is a 9-4 vote. The majority always wins. I talked to former chair of the Rules Committee, Mr. David Dreyer of California. In his 8 years as chairman of the Rules Committee, he never lost a vote, and he was very proud of that. 9-4, every single one was that way. The Rules Committee is the arm of the majority. And if you want to look at it, the House is kind of like baseball, right? In some ways like baseball. Imagine if the home team could set the rules. Because that's what the majority does, and that's what the Rules Committee does. And so if you have an amendment, if you want to have several amendments, if you want to have the majority party to have 5 outs, and 5 strikes, with the minority to have 1 out and 1 strikes? It does. And guess what? It happens every single week in the House. The majority party rules, and they rule through the Rules Committee. And so think about and study it a little bit further as to how these two institutions have evolved. One, to emphasize that right of the minority, the right of every senator, who all are equal, to speak, to let every voice be heard. But then look at the House of Representatives as the body where the majority is the one that gets its actions through. Think about how those two work in parallel. One last thing to think about it. One thing that's interesting is you look at this and you realize what an enormously complex process. I went over and you looked at the House of Commons. And the House of Commons, they have what are called supply bills. That's how their appropriations process works. The government ministries prepare their budget bills, their supply bills. They present them to the House of Commons, and they're passed the same day, maybe the next day. In the House, which remember has all powers of revenue, but also by tradition has appropriations bills, that process usually lasts maybe 13 months at the quickest. And it's sort of amazing to see is how many things, can anything ever get done in this Congress? And in some ways, you look at the founders and you realize they're designing not a majoritarian institution, but one whereby which Congress is not necessarily designed to pass laws, but rather to keep bad laws from getting passed. And so if you can get the House, majoritarian body, you can get almost anything done in the House, the Senate, which is very difficult to get much done, and then the President to sign off on that. If you can get those three branches, or not quite, but the 2 parts of Congress, 2 houses of Congress and the White House, if you can get them all to agree, it's worthy to become law. But one of the things that's exciting to me, the most exciting in many ways, is that the House of Representatives in there is truly representative. That to me is the most exciting as I look and see its evolution. in American history, because in there, that to follow Alexander Hamilton, as he looked at the House, here, sir, the people govern. And I want you to think about how do you teach that. So thanks.